It was a typical night in our house. My two sisters and I shared a bedroom, and though we sometimes stayed up talking or laughing, we usually fell asleep easily. But that night was different. There was something in the air, an oppressive, restless energy that none of us could ignore. We all felt it. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. My sisters shifted uncomfortably in their beds, and I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. None of us said a word, but I knew we were all wide awake. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every little sound. Even the usual creaks and groans of the house seemed to have stopped, as if it, too, was holding its breath. It felt like we were being watched, though I didn't know by what. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of unease, I noticed that my sisters were also restless. The tension in the room was unbearable, as though something was about to happen, something we wouldn't be able to explain or stop. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up with a start. I didn't know what had stirred me, maybe a noise, maybe just a gut feeling, but as I opened my eyes, I realized my sisters were awake too. None of us said a word, but I could see the same fear mirrored in their wide eyes. The window was open, letting in a faint breeze that sent chills down my spine. Then I saw it, a face, if you could even call it, that was staring in at us. It had no distinct features, no eyes, no nose, just a vague, blank shape where a face should have been. Yet, somehow, I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and invasive. My heart felt like it would stop as the three of us froze in place. We didn't scream. We didn't move. For a moment, we were paralyzed, caught in the unbearable grip of terror. Then, almost as if we'd all thought it at the same time, we bolted. We huddled together on one bed, clutching each other tightly, too afraid to even peek back at the window. "What is it?" one of my sisters whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer. I didn't know if it was a person or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it felt far more sinister than a mere intruder. As we lay there, huddled together, trying to make sense of what we had just seen, something else caught our attention. From the backyard, we started hearing it, a desperate, heart-wrenching cry from our two dogs. They weren't barking like usual. This was different. The sound was so mournful, so full of fear, it sent a cold shiver down my spine. It sounded like they were in pain, maybe even being attacked. I could hear their cries echoing through the house, each one more desperate than the last. It was like they were begging for help, but no one could reach them. My sisters and I looked at each other, frozen in terror. None of us dared move. The fear was suffocating. We could hardly breathe, paralyzed by the thought of whatever was out there. Should we go check on them? Should we risk it? But the thought of leaving the safety of the room, of encountering whatever was causing the dreadful sound, kept us still. The minutes felt like hours, and with each passing moment, the crying grew louder and more frantic. It felt like the world outside had turned into something monstrous, but we couldn't move. We just stayed there, clutching each other in the darkness, too afraid to even speak. After what felt like an eternity, the desperate cries of the dogs suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening. My sisters and I stayed motionless, holding our breath, as if the smallest sound might shatter the fragile calm. It was as if the world had paused. leaving us alone in a suffocating void. I dared to glance toward the window again, my heart pounding in my chest. The face that had haunted us was gone. But even though the figure had vanished, the feeling of being watched lingered, suffocating and uncheckable. It felt like eyes were still on us, hidden somewhere just out of view, studying every movement, every breath we took. Every little noise in the house seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt like a thunderous roar. Our minds were on edge, searching for any sign of what was coming next. It was impossible to relax. The tension in the air was unbearable. Time seemed to stretch on, each passing minute growing heavier, more suffocating. The only thing we could focus on was the agonizing wait for our mother to return. We clung to the hope that she would be there soon, but the silence was so oppressive that it felt like hours were slipping away, and we had no idea how much longer we could endure it. When my mom finally arrived, we rushed to her, still trembling with fear, unable to hold back the flood of words. We told her everything: the strange energy in the house, the face at the window, the horrifying cries of the dogs, and the suffocating silence that followed. We were so shaken that our voices barely made sense, but she listened, concern etched on her face. She seemed genuinely worried, but she tried to reassure us, telling us it was probably just our imagination or some kind of trick of the mind. Yet I could tell she didn't fully believe it herself. The way she glanced nervously at the window, as if expecting something to appear, made it clear she was feeling the same unease. Even after the night had passed, the presence of that strange event never fully left us. My sisters and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We would still glance nervously at the window, afraid to make eye contact with it, even during the day. The fear had settled deep within us, and the memory of the face was still fresh in our minds. The night had passed, but the terror lingered. It wasn't the kind of fear that fades quickly. No matter how many days went by, the unease never completely disappeared. The window, once just a simple part of our room, had become a gateway to something terrifying, and we never felt safe enough to look at it the same way again. My mom once told me a story from her childhood when she lived on a farm far from the bustle of city life. The isolation of the rural landscape, with its endless fields and dense woods, often brought a sense of peace, but also a lingering loneliness. Life there was quiet to quiet at times, and that night something felt off. One evening, she was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when she heard strange noises coming from the kitchen window. It was as if something or someone was outside, tapping or scraping against the glass. The sound was faint, but it was enough to disturb her, pulling her from her peaceful slumber. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so her curiosity got the better of her. The kitchen window overlooked the vast cornfield, and from there, the night always seemed still and impenetrable. But tonight was different. The eerie silence of the field felt disturbed, as if something was moving in the darkness, just beyond the reach of her sight. She couldn't help but wonder what it was. Driven by a mix of curiosity and an unsettling need to understand what was happening, my mom quietly got out of bed and moved toward the kitchen window. The room felt colder now, as if the air itself had thickened. She felt a chill that wasn't dust from the night's breeze, but something more ominous, something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, she stood there, frozen, staring at the window. A strange sense of dread gripped her, making her hesitate. It was as though the very air around her had changed, heavier, suffused with a presence she couldn't see but could almost feel pressing in. She was torn. Part of her wanted to stay hidden, to ignore the noises and go back to sleep, but another part of her felt compelled to find out what was out there. She finally mustered the courage and slowly slid the window open. As the cool night air rushed in, it seemed to wrap around her like a cold, invisible hand. The weight of the silence outside drew thicker as she looked into the darkness. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't back out now. She needed to know what was lurking just beyond her sight. As the window opened fully, she was immediately confronted by a sight that made her blood run cold. Standing just outside, in the darkness of the night, was a strange figure, something far from human. It wasn't a person, not at all. It was a mass of pure white, shapeless and unsettling, as though it was made of the very mist that clung to the earth at dawn. The face, or what should have been a face, was completely black. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features at all, just a smooth, featureless expanse of white. The moonlight seemed to bounce off of it in an unnatural way, casting an eerie, almost reflective glow that made it appear to shimmer, as if it was alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. A wave of terror washed over her, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. Her heart began to race, but her body froze in place. She couldn't look away, yet she couldn't move, as though the very air had thickened around her, suffocating her. Fear gripped her so tightly that she was paralyzed, caught in a trance between flight and frozen disbelief. Time seemed to stand still as she stared at the impossibility before her, unsure of what to do, but knowing she was facing something that no human being could comprehend. Every part of her screamed to close the window, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The strange figure, or rather the blotch of white, began to move, but it wasn't like anything a human could do. Didn't walk. It floated. Slowly and naturally, it drifted away from the window, as though it were weightless, hovering just above the ground. The air around it seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to allow this impossible thing to move. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. My mind was struggling to make sense of it. But the more I looked, the clearer it became that there was no rational explanation. The figure didn't belong to this world. It didn't belong in the night, in the quiet, in that peaceful farm. It was out of place, something foreign and wrong. It floated effortlessly, its movement silent, almost too smooth to be real. The figure moved further into the darkness, towards the cornfield. I could see it disappearing into the blackness, its white mass blending with the night as it vanished between the rows of crops. The darkness around it seemed to deepen, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold night air. The quiet was overwhelming, suffocating. No whine, no sound of insects or animals, just the oppressive silence. The fear in my chest tightened. I knew that what I had seen was not natural, and that whatever it wasn't going to just disappear. The terror was suffocating, a weight I could not shake, knowing I had witnessed something beyond comprehension. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away, my heart pounding as I waited for it to reappear. The figure slowly faded into the cornfield, its presence swallowed by the darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too paralyzed by shock to speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed, but nothing made sense. The figure, the way it floated, the absence of any defining feature set was all too much. My body was shaking uncontrollably, as if it couldn't process the horror I had seen. To this day, what happened that night remains a mystery. There was no explanation for the strange figure in the cornfield, no reason why it appeared or where it came from. The image of that blank, featureless face haunts me even now, and I can't shake the feeling that something truly supernatural was behind it all. The terror I felt that night has stayed with me, lingering like a shadow in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that some things cannot be understood. Over the years, I've told this story, passing it down through generations, but it never loses its power to terrify. Each time I recount it, the fear rises again, as fresh and real as it was all those years ago. The same unease grips me, and I speak of it, and I know my children and grandchildren will feel it too. We all carry this shared terror, knowing that whatever that thing was, it should never have happened, and it never should have been allowed to enter our world. The mystery of the cornfield remains unsolved, with no answers, only silence. But the fear it left behind continues to linger, a silent presence that no one dares to question. That night marked something unexplainable in my life, and it will forever be a part of the story I pass on, just as unresolved and terrifying as it ever was.